Long, long ago, there was an orchard full of the tastiest, crispest, sweetest, most beautiful apples that you had ever seen. They were gorgeous. This apple orchard had blossoms of pink and of white in the spring. Bees and other insects would visit them. The apples would ripen and there were reds and greens, and when you picked them, they were the most delicious things you had ever experienced. Underneath the apple trees there roamed flocks of hens who would cluck and squawk and proudly announce every time an apple fell. And life was good. The orchard was cared for, and it was a happy place to be. Children skipped under the branches. Some of them even climbed the trees so that they could take some apples, and the trees were happy. And then, well, over time, the orchard was abandoned. It was forgotten about. Weeds grew up underneath the trees, and the hens no longer roamed underneath. Children didn't climb their branches anymore. In fact, no one came to visit the orchard anymore. And this went on for years and years, and the apple trees were lonely. And one by one, they began to wither and die. And at the edge of the apple orchard, there was an old, old tree. She had been the oldest tree in all the orchard, and she had watched the other trees grow and bloom just as she had grown and bloomed. But she was nearly at the end. She knew she didn't have much life left in her, not much energy left, but she still hoped. She still hoped that maybe the children would come back one day, that people would remember the orchard and the fruits that they provided and the happy memories that were had there. This year, well, she decided to put as much of her last failing energy as she could into producing as many leaves as possible, and they soaked up the sunshine. And she produced some blossoms, not as many as she once had, but they were no less beautiful and no less fragrant than they'd ever been. And this year, well, she'd managed to produce 3 of the most beautiful apples that she'd ever managed to make. 3 beautiful, scrumptious, delicious apples, and she stuck her branch out over the track that sometimes people still walked up. And she waited. And as she waited with her apples, she sang a little song to herself. Look at my apples, 1, 2, 3. Look inside and treasure you'll see. And she waited, and she waited, and she waited. Eventually, a man was running late for work one day, and he'd cut through the fields, hoping to find a shortcut. He'd been so late for work, he'd forgotten to pack himself a lunch, and as he passed the orchard by, he stopped and looked up, and there, amongst the branches, he could see an apple. A beautiful, round, red, shiny apple. That will do for my lunch, he thought, and he reached up and he picked the apple. And it smelt so sweet and delicious, and it was small and perfectly formed, and it smelt just wonderful. He decided that actually he couldn't wait till lunchtime, and he ate it there and then. And when he was finished, he took the core and he threw it into the bushes and hurried on his way. And the apple tree was sad because he hadn't found the treasure. But she stood and she waited. But now she only had 2 apples left, and she hoped someone would find the treasure. And she didn't have to wait long because just the very next day, a woman happened to walk up that way, reminding herself of childhood memories when she used to play amongst the trees. And there, at the side of the track, she saw an apple tree holding on to 2 ripe, juicy apples. And she smiled as she remembered climbing in the trees when she was a little girl. And she reached up and she picked the apple. She picked the apple and smiled at it. It was beautiful. It was just the most perfect apple she'd ever seen. It was red and it was glossy. It had a perfect leaf on one side. It was beautiful. She decided it was too good to eat, and so she got her handkerchief out of her bag and she wrapped the apple up and put it into her bag for later, and carried on to market, smiling all the way. And when she got home that evening, she took the apple out of the bag and she unwrapped it. She unwrapped it and it was just so beautiful. She set it on her dresser and she got out her sketch pad and she sat down and she sketched the apple. And then she painted the apple and she smiled and remembered all the memories of playing in apple orchards when she was a child. And then she got her handkerchief back out and she wrapped the apple up once more and she put it into the drawer of the dresser and she forgot about it. And the apple spoiled and began to rot. And in the orchard, the apple tree was sad because the woman hadn't found the treasure either. And now there was only one apple left. And the weeks wore on and nobody else came past. Nobody came to the orchard. Nobody even walked past on the track. Nobody was around. And the winds howled and the nights lengthened and the days got shorter. And her leaves fell one by one until she was a sorry-looking sight. A sad, sorry apple tree who didn't think she would have the strength to bloom at all next year. Then one day, it was the day before Halloween, and two children could be heard on the lane outside. The apple tree listened. Two small voices. They were talking about what they were going to dress up as to go guising. They were talking about jokes and songs and going apple bobbing. And then one of them happened to look up, and there was an apple. It had lost some of its shine. It had some spots and was looking a little withered, and there were no leaves left on the tree. But even still, there was an apple, and the children helped each other climb up the apple tree so that they could reach out across its branch, and they picked the last of the apples. They looked at it and wondered what to do. It was a little shriveled, but it would probably still taste fine, so they agreed maybe they should eat it. But one of the children, they said, hang on a minute. And from their pocket, they got a small penknife. And they opened the penknife and they cut the apple in half. They cut the apple in half. And there, in the middle of the apple, was a star. The most beautiful, perfect star you've ever seen. And each of the children took one half of the apple, and inside they took out the pips. One by one they lifted out the little tiny pips of the apple, and they looked at each other and they smiled and they looked around the old orchard, and in the gaps next to where the old apple trees had been, they made a hole in the soft ground, and one by one they planted the pips of the apple tree. And then, once all the pips had been planted and patted down, and they marked where they were to be so they could come back and visit, they went back to the old apple tree and they said thank you. And they each ate their half of the apple and went home to get ready for guising. And the apple tree, oh, the old apple tree was so happy. She was so happy because somebody had finally found the treasure, and they had planted the pips. Because you see, you can count the number of pips inside an apple, but you can't count the number of apples inside a pip.